Welcome to the PTSD Nation podcast. Today, we have the honor of speaking with Dov Maisel, the Chief Operations Officer and one of the founders of United Hatzalah, which has a vast network of thousands of volunteers in Israel and around the world dealing with crisis and mass casualty event. And Dov is a PTSD survivor himself and a combat paramedic with extensive experience in the IDF, Israel Defense Forces. And Dovi's journey and innovations in emergency medical services have had a profound impact on individuals and communities affected by trauma. Dovi, thank you for joining us and welcome. Let's dive right into our conversation. Could you perhaps start off by sharing a little bit about your personal journey and how it has influenced your understanding of PTSD and its impact on individuals and communities?
First of all, thank you for having me on this special podcast. I think that talking about PTSD is something that is so important. As a healthcare professional, as a paramedic of many years, I find that in the macho world of the professionals, people tend to hide it. And I try sort of to lead the way here in Israel and understanding that there's nothing to be ashamed. We do our best in doing what we're doing and saving lives, and it takes its toll. And we need to address this. So now to your question, my story goes back to when I was a little kid. When I started my journey in the world of EMS, it actually started way before when I was only like 9 years old, when I witnessed a horrific accident as a third grader coming back from school. I was sitting in the bus stop and I saw a little girl that was hit by a bus and unfortunately killed. And it turns out that she ended up being a girl from my own school, from the first grade. And I saw the helplessness of people. Nobody knew what to do. People were just screaming and shouting. And the only thing that I could do, I just ran home like an 8-year-old in third grade. And I told myself that when I grow up, I'm going to do something that we won't be helpless. So my go-to was, of course, that I need to become a doctor. I didn't contemplate back then that to become a doctor, you actually have to be good at school. So when I was about 14, I started volunteering on an ambulance here in Jerusalem. And I felt this was my calling. That was it. And I've been in the system ever since. I also went through, like I said, the IDF as a combat medic. And then I went on to the professional life of being a paramedic. And I think that when talking about my personal journey is throughout my lifeline of growing up and going into the professional world of EMS here in Israel, being exposed to not only, the heart attacks and car accidents, which might be terrible, but unfortunately over the past 3 decades that I've been in this, it is being exposed to many terror attacks. I myself responded here in Jerusalem to over 50 suicide bombers in the past 25 years and hundreds of terror attacks, which exposes us to extreme situations. And back in the day, I was macho. I'd start my day with a suicide bomber on a bus with 17 people killed and 70 injured and gates of hell. Or going through the Machne Yehuda market, the famous Jerusalem market, with a double suicide bomber with hundreds of people injured. And, we finished the event and then I go on with my day like nothing happened.
It's an interesting point you make here. You may be aware, I also have PTSD as a result of child sexual abuse. And yet after all those years, I ended up returning to both volunteer and work within that field. Similarly, you have PTSD as a result of a trauma and you've returned to that field. And we see that elsewhere. How do you make sense of this?
I'm not returning. I just never left. Like a magnet, it pulls you in even stronger. For me, when this exploded when my PTSD exploded, like I said, we were big macho men that nothing affects us. All in a day's work, except it catches up after 20 years. It took 20 some years, but it caught up big time. And I understood, I was identifying the symptoms on myself, and it took me about half a year of not sleeping at night.
I've spoken mainly to people who have experienced other forms of trauma, of physical assaults, abuse, and that kind of thing. And usually there is also shame, guilt, and other factors that play a role in taking so long for that PTSD understanding to come into play. But here, it's not necessarily shame and guilt are not necessarily involved. So why does it take 20 years for someone like yourself, for example?
So honestly, it's not shame and guilt because there is no shame and guilt, but it's the macho. I'm a paramedic. I've been through the IDF 20 some years in reserves, been through wars, been through everything. Now I'm weak. I'm going to show, I'm going to get up and say that something's wrong with me. So it took a half a year. It took a half a year. And this happened after the Meron crowd crush that happened with 45 people that were killed in a crowd crush in the Lag BaOmer festival in Meron, which I managed, and I was in the heart. And as I speak now, I have the goosebumps all over. And it exploded after that. It had nothing to do with that event. It took me back 20 years, and it took me half a year to actually get up and say, yes, I have PTSD, and I went to get help. And even now, when I'm talking to you, I just came back from a session this morning that I had with my therapist, because it's been months. Since October 7th, this was my first session that I went back to after half a year almost of being out of therapy because of the October 7th events.
We'll get back to the 7th of October in a moment, but I'm just wondering in terms of specifically, maybe share first a particularly challenging or emotional moment from your time in responding to emergency and how in particular it informed your understanding of PTSD.
So initially, when I started to think back on what were the real first symptoms, this goes back many more years, and that was with my ability to deal. I had no problem with dealing with the horrific sight of the bombings, of the grotesque sights on scene there that no human eye should see. But I dealt with that okay. What I found was, and it really triggered, this was after my first daughter was born, 2003, and I became a father. And this was in the midst of the terror wave here when buses and restaurants were blowing up every day. And suddenly I found that I didn't have a problem in the field responding or doing my job, but I couldn't handle looking at the grief of the families. Meaning when you see the funerals on TV, when you go to the cemeteries and you connect the emotion behind the loss, connecting the human body, the person that I was just treating, connecting that to a whole life story behind it. It makes it, and that's where it really hit me, understanding that there might be something. I ignored it for many years, and then it just became.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it blows up often, exactly. And then often in a situation when you least expect it and when you're not necessarily equipped to actually deal with it. I'm interested in your time. You served in the Israeli Defense Force and the IDF across 4 different wars, on top of everything else you've done. How have you observed the progress in terms of mental health practices and support within the IDF at an operational level?
I'll say very simple, clear cut. 20 years ago, there was nothing. Today, there's almost everything. And I will say that October 7th was the milestone of where the IDF really changed their approach to this. And in the past couple of years, there has been significant progress, but it really completed and accelerated. The IDF made tremendous progress. It comes on a few levels. Number one is today when troops come out of combat zone in Gaza, they don't go home immediately.
Yes.
They go to a 2-day retreat, 2 or 3 day retreat in the interim, which regularizes them to normal life outside of the combat zone, where they go through the debriefs and the venting and ODT and other things that they do together to normalize themselves from combat back into a normalcy, into real life. And I think that's something that was non-existent in the past.
Are you aware of anything similar to this in other armies in the world, just out of interest?
Actually, I've not seen it. I've not investigated it either. That's the truth. But I will say that we see the dramatic difference of those who come out from combat, whether it's 1, 2, 3 months in combat and come out and go through this process and back to their families, back to their kids, back to society, as opposed to those who are injured and are flown out of Gaza. They're pulled out of combat. They land within 20 minutes in a hospital. And then if they're not terribly injured, then within a few days, they're back out, but without this gradual process.
Yeah.
And you can see how the trauma hits them significantly harder.
Interesting. What are some of the main lessons from the experience in the military that you had in terms of assisting your role in Hatzalah? Are there any main?
Yeah, absolutely. In so many ways, I would say on the operational level, looking at, United Hatzalah is an emergency medical service. So we do, respond to 2,000 emergencies every 24 hours, at 700,000 emergencies a year. that are responded to by volunteers on thousands of motorcycles, ambulances, helicopters, and whatnot. The operational capabilities, the skill set of being able to make decisions under pressure, to make a strategic long-term planning for operational situations, preparing for war, preparing for earthquake, preparing for the mass casualty incidents. It's bringing a lot of the military skills into the civilian arena, which is very unique here in Israel. And we try to share this with colleagues in different services around the world.
A lot of people, or some people may not be aware of the difference between MDA, Magen David Adom, and Hatzalah, whether in Israel or globally. What are the distinctions?
Quite simple. Magen David Adom is the government ambulance service, which is mandated by law and the government, and they're responsible for the ambulance service throughout Israel. Compare it to NHS in the UK, compare it to NHS in Australia or wherever. And we're a full volunteer non-government organization, which activates over 7,000 volunteers, men, women, Jews, Arabs, from all sectors of life in Israel, which is a community-based emergency organization, which the ultimate goal of what we do is to bridge the gap between the time that the emergency occurs and the time the NDA ambulance arrives. Imagine 2,000 calls, the ambulance response times can run anywhere between 10 and 25 minutes. But if someone's choking, they don't have 10 minutes. And help is not the ambulance. Not ambulances that save lives, it's people. And if you have enough people spread out in the community all around, and we have technology, which is like Uber technology, that knows to identify the people in the community and dispatch them immediately to the scene and respond within 90 seconds, that's United Hatzalah. That's what we need, the 90-second goal.
Wow. Now we move to talking about the almost the elephant in the room in many ways, what's been going on here in Israel and the impact it had on us. Interested to hear from you in terms of the impact of the events of October 7th on the mental health of the victims and the responders, particularly in the context of PTSD.
I'll try to make sense of it all. So we have in United Hatzalah what we call the Psychotrauma unit, which is comprised of hundreds of professional mental health care professionals, therapists, social workers, psychologists with unique skills and experience in trauma. And we've been operating for years already internally for our own responders, of course, which are exposed to extreme incidents, whether it's terror or whether it's a child that unfortunately was killed in an accident or a baby that didn't wake up at home. And we understood years ago that this capability, which has been proven amazing, because anytime any of our responders responds to an extreme case, within less than 24 hours, one of our psychotrauma unit specialists will reach out to him and vent him for an initial debrief call, which is very unique. I mean, we understood that this tool can be leveraged in the community and not only to leave it for us as responders. And this unit has been operational now for, I think, 5 or 6 years already. And on a daily basis, while paramedics and EMTs are doing CPR, we're trying to revive and rescue a person, our psychotrauma unit responders are there now within 90 seconds, 6 minutes, and are able to start the intervention with the surroundings, whether it's family or bystanders that witnessed a terrible situation or a terror attack, and start working with them. And it prevents the need. What used to happen historically is these people who are exposed to this, we call them the silent victim, or they don't have any physical injuries, but then they get transported to the ER of the hospital because nobody knew what to do with them. And then what are we doing? We're deepening the exposure to trauma in the environment of a hospital in the middle of a terror attack. So we understood that this tool is amazing, and people are no longer taken to the hospital just because they're suffering from a traumatic event that they witnessed. And we're doing this on the community level. And in regarding to October 7th, in the midst of October 7th, during the Shabbat in the morning, I understood that we're being exposed to an incident on a scale that we've never experienced, or not me in my lifetime. And I immediately ordered to activate the psychotrauma unit at full capacity, because I knew that in a few hours, I didn't know yet at this point how big the event, but I knew that there will be the aftermath. And we'll be needing to do massive response here to hundreds of responders, and not only, but also the community. And as the day went on and we saw the magnitude of this event unfolding, I understood that this is something that, forget about the medical response that we were providing and treating hundreds and hundreds, over 1,000 people that we treated on this day. But I understood that this is going to be a mass casualty psychotrauma event for our responders and also for community. And from Saturday night they already started going into action. And those volunteers who were going off and finishing their response of 12 hours or 13 hours, we immediately had them go through an initial briefing in the outskirts of the southern region. We had them go down. We set up tents there already. And as they were leaving the area, we had them go through the Psychotrauma unit tents that we opened to have an initial briefing. And I can say that within 48 hours, October 8th, 9th, and into the 10th, we responded to almost 2,000 volunteers and people, civilians, whether it's policemen, MDA workers, fire department, soldiers, the miluim of reserves that were going in, that were reaching out. And this was unprecedented on any scale. And we had them operating throughout weeks post October 7th, and tremendous response there.
Wow. I'm sure a lot of difficult, challenging work on that day for so many people. Have you felt any ongoing, lingering issues that some of your staff have had to deal with, in particular, the volunteers, and how you address that?
Bear in mind
that the trauma doesn't go from trauma into PTSD, most importantly.
Exactly. And what happened was our volunteers were operating under fire there, head on, with terrorists coming at them, shooting at their cars, at the ambulances, being exposed to the most grotesque, horrific sights that no human being should see. And I'm not going to go into the details, especially not on a PTSD as a trigger, but yes. And we've had volunteers that to this day are still not back in operation and undergoing heavy therapy because of the sights that they were exposed to on this day. But at large, I can say that when we're talking about response over 1,000 volunteers, if I'm talking about 10 or 15 volunteers that are in ongoing treatment, 20 volunteers that are in a more extreme situation, the vast majority of them, the intervention was done fast enough, and time will tell. We don't know yet.
Yes.
Future, we don't know what the future beholds, but we know that they're back into life. They're back to their families. They're back to work, back to some normalcy, and not carrying the baggage and of the trauma that they were exposed to, which was extreme to levels that no one can even understand.
Exactly. And ultimately, you and Hatzalah has provided them the greatest opportunity to avoid that, things will linger and become into PTSD, which is correct.
Because we understand, and I myself personally understand what happens when you don't. And I come out, as the big manager and the big commander and operations and everything. I say, people, I suffer from PTSD. There is nothing to be ashamed of. And I call on everyone. And we literally pushed it down their throats, literally, whether they want to do it or not. And we told people, come to the circles. You don't have to talk. Just be there.
Yeah.
Up to you. And we found that the biggest macho ego guys that we had there and super women that we have there ended up opening up at one stage or another. If not in the first session, possibly in the second.
Creating a space and making people feel safe.
We're creating an environment, an ongoing environment. We keep emphasizing it time and time again on a weekly basis to all of the volunteers. If you feel it, we have an anonymous line that they can call. And not only that, but if you have further treatments that you need, we pay for the treatments, and the receipts go out anonymously so that nobody in the system here, inside our system, even knows.
Yeah.
It could be a colleague of mine in the office next door, and I won't know that they're undergoing the treatment.
That's really a textbook type of approach to addressing these types of issues. So commendable and inspiring. What advice would you have for individuals in Israel and across the world who are struggling with PTSD, or maybe supporting people with PTSD, diagnosed or undiagnosed? Because often a lot of people, as we know, carry the symptoms, but don't do. So in your experience and knowledge, what would your best advice be to these individuals?
So first of all, if you're suffering PTSD and you see the symptom, don't ignore it. There's no reason to suffer. If you're not sleeping at night, you have, the word panic attack sounds so, and you think you see someone hysterical. No, panic attack can be goosebumps suddenly that run through your body from a certain situation. They can be sleepless nights, nightmares. It could be suddenly you feel the palpitations, you feel your pulse suddenly speed up a little bit. Don't ignore it. There's no reason to suffer. I suffer with the therapy, with everything. I suffer, and I'm not ashamed to say it, and I call on everyone. There is no reason. I say that therapy doesn't do magic. It doesn't. It won't make it disappear. It won't make me the person I was 25 years ago before I started, but it gives me the tools to continue my day. It gives me the tools to maintain life. And that's the most important thing, is to understand that you can work, you can have a family, and with all the challenges, it gives you the tools. There's nothing to be ashamed of. There's no reason to suffer. And if those supporting is to be sophisticated, if your family member or whatever, or colleague at work is ignoring, try to be smart, create, be a snake, create an intervention which is unplanned. Get other people in the intervention so they don't understand it's focused only on them. Be creative, be creative.
It also goes back to what you said earlier, which is about creating a safe space and an environment that someone will feel comfortable enough to actually seek help and acknowledge it. So yeah, great advice. One of the things here at PTSD Nation that we're trying to focus on, and we'll be focusing on even more in the future, is about innovation, cutting edge, whether it's therapies, whether it's technologies. Are there any technologies, innovative technologies that you either use, implement, wish you would have access to?
So we always try to be ahead of the curve when it comes to technology, whether it comes to life-saving or everything. At PTSD and the treatment is no different. And we're actually in the process now of implementing one of the most advanced technologies that have come out with the studies and FDA and everything. And it's a company that's called XR Health, which has these VR goggles, and it puts you through an experience. It's a treatment. It's therapy. It's FDA approved. Not just a nice, good feel experience. It's with a mental health care professional that goes through the session, and it incorporates all sorts of different methods inside, whether it's EMDR or others, combined in this therapy in an environment which can enable us to get better outreach to more people, because the therapist does not have to be with you. Yep. You can be connected to the device, and the therapist can be in another city, controlling and talking to you into the earpieces, and you've seen your experience there. We really try to take any tool. We're using the pressure chamber. We have team members which are in therapy in the pressure chambers here in Israel in different facilities. We really are looking at any opportunity, any technology that's been proven. Obviously, we're not experimenting. We won't experiment on our people, but we are taking every tool that is out there in order to try and better the treatment and the mental stability of our volunteers.
Amazing. How do you personally cope with some of the challenges and the traumas that you've experienced in your role and previously? Practical tools or something perhaps also that you would like to do more, but you can't because of time constraints or financial constraints or whatever?
Well, first of all, I wish I had more time for more therapy, honestly. It's different tricks of the trade that we develop over the years of how to deal with the situations. I'm not giving this as a recommendation because it's just a method that I developed in my field, because I'm treating human beings, I'm treating people. And sometimes they're in an extreme situation. So I create sort of like a blockage. If you'll ask me what my patient looked like, I'll be able to tell you what his symptoms look like, what his skin tone looked like, what he felt like. I will not remember his face. I created literally a blockage to create because I could not handle anymore the amount of faces and exposure. So I created a distinction, and I can look at the person but not actually remember their face. If you show me a photo of them, I won't recognize it. And then the therapist gives us other tricks and trades of how to deal with them. If I feel that panic attack growing inside me, so I know, okay, my word code is whatever it is. And then I go to my word code just for a second. On October 7th, I did it a few times, and it worked. It simply worked. It put me back in focus.
That sharing what word is, what can you explain that a little bit more? What is it actually?
I personally was treated in different methods. One of them was EMDR. And in the process of EMDR with the clickers, I routed my brain to one of the terrible terror attacks, which I was exposed to many years ago in Moment Cafe. There was a suicide bomber there. I went through the process of rewiring my brain that in this situation, I basically taught myself in this situation, when I feel the panic attack starts, my word code, and I can say it, I'm not ashamed to say it, is I'm professional. I'm doing what I'm doing best now, and I've got nothing to worry about. And basically, I go back into that, and I get the chills when I say it. Even now when I'm saying the word code, I get the chills, but it gives me that focused and I can keep going. The
Amazing.
center, the balance.
Final question. What advice would you give to others who are interested in pursuing a career in emergency medical services or volunteer work in this field?
First of all, I always recommend, because there's nothing greater than saving lives. There is nothing greater. That said, don't come to the job from the macho perspective. Come in a humble situation. Come to know that you're doing the best you can. You can't save the world. You're not going to save everyone. You can only do your best, and make sure to always be aware and make sure to go and get that briefing session after that hard call, and treat yourself along the way and be very, very aware, because there's nothing more fulfilling than saving lives. There is nothing more fulfilling, but there is nothing more challenging than taking the blame and guilt of not being able to save others and create that balance within.
Amazing. Dovi, all I can say is thank you. It's been amazing to speak to you, for you sharing your insights, your experiences. Really, your dedication in saving lives and improving mental health and support is truly inspiring. And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of PTSD Nation. Stay tuned for further conversations that will shed light on the impact of trauma and the importance of mental health support. Thank you, and shalom from Israel.